Thank you, Ali. I appreciate this very much, this opportunity to speak to your audience, and welcome to your audience here as you've joined for this presentation on organizational culture, eat strategy for breakfast. Excuse me. So I just want to start briefly with a little introduction. I appreciate Ali's introduction. Just want to give you a little bit more background on who I am and what I do. First and foremost, I consider it most important to be a family man. I have 3 children, 10, 8, and 6, 2 boys and a girl, and I consider that my highest responsibility to be a leader of my own home before I can be a leader in business. Secondarily, I'm a small business leader. Over the last 10 years, I've managed several different organizations or departments in the $2 to $5 million a year range. I really cut my teeth and got my start with a company called Lomolux Laboratories or Plymouth Pharmaceuticals. There's 2 organizations in one. They sold skincare medicines through nationwide retailers in the U.S., so that would be Target, Rite Aid, and Walgreens. I moved on from there, worked there for a little over 4 years. That was in Oklahoma, where I grew up in the States, and then I moved to the frozen tundra, as they call it, up north in Wisconsin, and worked for an organization called Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage that presents marriage seminars both in the States and internationally. Mark Gunger, who is the talent of that organization that travels really the world, presenting marriage conferences and helping enrich marriage relationships. From there, I left there and went to work for an organization called Rawhide Boys Ranch. As Ali mentioned, in the States, we have something here where people can donate their vehicle to receive a tax deduction, a charitable tax deduction as we call it, to support a nonprofit organization. So my organization and their mission is to help at-risk or troubled youth really rehabilitate many of them that have been through severe abuse and all kinds of other challenges in their life. We take them in, and my department brings in a little over $4 million in annual revenues in vehicle donations to help support that mission. So I'm also a passionate servant leader. You may have heard that term before, maybe not. It's certainly here in the States becoming more in vogue, and it's something that people are talking more about. It's something I don't just try to talk about, I try to live out, not only in my business and professional life, but in my personal life. And I'll talk a little bit more about servant leadership as we go through the talk and my presentation. So let's start with the importance of culture, which is really what the title of this presentation is all about. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I can't take credit for that line. Peter Drucker, the famous management, really a father of modern business management literature, is Peter Drucker, and he coined that phrase or that term. And I think it's a very important one because so often we get so focused on strategy, and don't get me wrong, strategy is very important. We can't throw it out. We have to have it. It is central to the success of any business or department, but we often miss how important culture is. And that statement that Peter Drucker made was really to try to get people to wake up and understand how important culture is. So every organization has a strong culture. It's just whether it's a positive or a negative culture. And there's varying degrees within that. Not that everybody's on one end of the spectrum or the other. Can be somewhere in between. But some of the negative types of culture would be greed, a culture of lying, pride, gossip, team dysfunction, people who are what I call emotionally unhealthy people that don't know how to get along and work within a team system. Some of the positive culture traits are generosity, teamwork, truthfulness, sacrifice, and in general, working well as a team. Not that there isn't conflict, but resolving conflict in an appropriate manner. And unfortunately, that's not all that common in the workplace, at least here in the States, and I would expect in your part of the world, you have some of the same challenges that we do. As I like to say, people are people, no matter where you are in the world. And really the resolution of those challenges in relationships among people on a team, either within a department or just within an entire company, is something that's we often forget about or don't give enough time and attention to like we do strategy. So that's really kind of sets the groundwork for what we're going to talk about here. You know, I talked about on the website that there's 7 steps to increasing your organizational culture. And the first one really is recognizing your weaknesses. Also could be called being more self-aware. Some of us are more self-aware than others. Some of us aren't, and I think that's really the first step to becoming a servant leader and really a successful leader, is recognizing who you are, what your strengths and weaknesses are. David Ogilvy says, hire smaller and we become a company of dwarfs. By hiring people who are bigger, we become a company of giants. And obviously he's not talking about literally smaller or bigger people. He's talking metaphorically speaking, people who have more talents, more experience. The tendency is to hire people underneath us who have less talents, less ability, less experience. And it's important for us to recognize that we have to set aside our own pride and our own ego for the better of the organization or department. And that's something that's hard for all of us to do. You know, we can talk about humility and being humble. Being humble and leading with humility does not necessarily mean weakness. There can be an incredible strength there because you are choosing to lead from a position of true strength rather than one of ego and really insecurity. So this is something I strive for in everyday work life, is not to be threatened by other people that maybe they might outshine me, but to realize that I need people smarter and more skilled that report to me that can help build the organization or the department. The second step ties right into that, hiring the right people. You may say, well, what are the right people? How do I hire the right people? And it's certainly more art than science. It is not an easy proposition, and it's something that I think takes a lot of time, a lot of practice to determining what is the right person. And by the right person, what I mean is emotional health. Someone who is a team player, will get along with the rest of your teammates, will challenge, but challenge appropriately and professionally. Someone, I don't know if you've heard this term, who has a high EQ instead of IQ, IQ being intelligence quotient, EQ meaning emotional quotient. Someone who has a higher level, not just technical intelligence, but who understands how best to manage relationships within a work environment and help the team to be successful. Plato said, good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will always find a way around laws. And I think that really highlights the fact that so often, instead of hiring the right people, we try to put in place things that are rules, guidelines, and those are certainly important in any organization. You have to have certain expectations and rules, But if you don't have the right people, then you will not ever get a good result out of your people and out of your team if you don't have the right people. So I think it's very important to focus on hiring those right people, hiring the right fit for your culture, your organizational culture, and that's different within every organization or even within a department. It's something that we always have to remind ourselves, because our first nature is, well, we just need a better policy, we need a better rule to prevent X, Y, or Z from happening in our organization. So, and one of the things I did want to touch on too, I know that every culture has challenges with this, both in the States, and I'm sure you do too there in your part of the world, but dealing with nepotism or hiring family members or even extended family members. It's a challenge, I think, in almost all culture, and I think it's something we have to be aware of and make sure that, and understand that in most cases, nepotism is not a good thing. It can be a good thing. It can be a good thing in the sense that you have somebody who you already know and trust, rather than somebody you're hiring who you don't really know, you don't really trust, and don't have that comfort level there. But I think it's something that too often we're not willing to have the tough conversation on the front end with that family member that, hey, you're still going to have to perform at a high level like any other employee, and making sure those expectations are that, hey, if this doesn't work out, you know, it'll end just like it would some other employee. I'm not going to keep you on just because you know, you're related to me. And I think that's important not only for that person's performance and their career and setting them up for success, but also setting the rest of the team up for success. The rest of the team is going to know whether if you give favoritism to a family member. They're going to see it, and they're going to lose a level of respect for you if you allow that to happen. So the next step is equipping personnel. This one might seem like common sense. Colin Powell said, "A good leader equips his followers well for the task ahead." And you think, well, Miles, you know, I know how to equip my personnel. I do that every day, and I think most of us do that well, or in a decent sense. But I think we can get caught up in the day-to-day grind of business and miss the fact that our employees may not have all the resources they need to do their job. And this can take so many different avenues. It can be finances, it can be equipment, it can even be other departments, getting them to help your team members, training, even outside vendors, making sure that your team has all of the necessary tools to do what you're asking them to do. Because oftentimes, and I know I do it, we think, well, I need my team to do this, or I need this person to complete this project or this task, and we quickly rush off and say, here, go do this, and we don't really give them all the tools that they're going to need to accomplish that task or that project. And oftentimes, then that task or project gets bogged down. We get frustrated with them. We don't understand why it's not getting done. And when we really sit down and look at it, sometimes it comes down to making sure we give them the right equipment or the right resources. Next, the next step is setting expectations. And so often, I know here in the States, and I would guess it's similar in the Middle East as well, we rush to hire somebody because we have a need, a real business need for some project or task to be done, and we don't take the time on the front end to set those expectations. And I can guarantee you, if you don't set the expectations for your employees, they or others will. That's really that a vacuum of expectations is created there, and that has to be filled. They will fill it with their own expectations of what they think is important if you don't. This includes both at the beginning of starting employment with a new employee. It's important to set those expectations, but as things move along and progress, while they're working for you in that organization, you have to continually set expectations, or even in some cases reset expectations. Those expectations may need to change. The business, the department that you're working in, it goes through change. And as leaders, we can get very busy and focused on all the things that need to get done and forget about the fact that we've got to sit down on a regular basis and set those expectations. Being direct and setting those expectations doesn't have to be mean or cruel. It just means we need to sit down and have a frank discussion around, here's what I see you're doing well, here's what I need you to continue to do, to stop doing, and to start doing. And I believe true leadership clearly communicates those expectations and is really the only way to hold people accountable. Poor leadership does neither of those. It doesn't want to set expectations, doesn't want to hold people accountable because it's worried of that it's going to offend somebody or hurt somebody. Now, this is not an excuse for us to be cruel, mean managers, but being direct does not have to be mean. And the bottom line is the type of team members that you want to retain, those team members desire clear communication and clear expectations about what you expect of them and their work. It's important to set those guardrails to empower them to make decisions within an authority that you've given them. So you don't want to become the bottleneck either of them always having to bring decisions to you for every little thing. The more you can give them those expectations and say within these boundaries is where you have authority to make decisions, then they're truly empowered to go out and do the work that you're asking them to do. The next step is getting out of the way. And I think this is hardest for leaders to accept because as leaders, you have to have a certain level of ego and a certain level of chutzpah, for lack of a better word, to lead, to be successful at leading, to be in charge, to be able to make decisions, and in some cases make tough decisions. You have to have a certain level of ego. But we have to learn to set that aside. And once we've done all of these other steps leading up to this, we really have to get out of the way. And I would say this is really one of the top things that holds companies or departments or teams from being successful. It holds them back. And you might achieve a certain level of success, a modest level of success, but you will never achieve a high level of success because your highest performers want to be given boundaries within which they can operate, those expectations, and then they want you to get out of the way and let them do their job. And we should, because the reality is we've hired them to do a job, we've asked them to do a job, and in many cases we come in and micromanage it. And we focus so much on trying to tell them or show them how to do their job rather than getting out of the way once we've set up good expectations. And truly, we may think we're in control of those employees, but it's only the illusion of control. We can only control those employees up to a certain point, and we have to recognize that illusion of control and allow them the opportunity to fail or to make a mistake. I believe that is often the best teacher, is allowing them to, we don't want to let them fail at a high level and kill the department or kill the team or kill a product or something that is very important to the organization, but at the same time we can't be so afraid or so controlling of our employees that we don't allow them to fail, because then they won't grow and the organization won't grow and it won't get stronger without allowing them some ability to fail on some level. The next step is showing appreciation. It is truly the small things that matter. It's not the big demonstrative gifts or presentations to people. And I often find it's different for every person. Some people like appreciation amongst their peers. So recognizing them in a meeting amongst all of their peers is very important to them. Other people don't want to be recognized in front of their peers. Other people, it might be a small gift. It might be something you do with your team as a whole. And I know this may sound trite or something that seems really touchy-feely and why does this have any place in business? But my experience is that it matters. The most remarkable life moments in all of our lives are things, more often than not, that were small things. Somebody did something that was memorable, but it wasn't a huge thing, and that made an impression on us. And I think in the business world, we often get so focused on business and getting things done, and that's very important. I have high expectations of my employees to get things done, but we need to be able to stop and show appreciation and recognition for the work that people are doing. And really it comes down to sharing the recognition of the team's success with them and not taking that recognition all for ourselves. The next step, or I would say kind of the final step and the challenge, I think, in leadership is letting people go, firing people, laying them off when that is required. And that is a very hard thing to do for most people. There are the minority of people that may have no problem doing this or are sadly enjoy doing this, but I think for most people it's very hard to do because this is a very personal thing. We've worked with these people in many cases for many years. But the key thing we have to remember is we should always sacrifice the many for the one, not the one for the many. And what I mean by that is if you have a low-performing team member, you owe it to them to sit down with them and explain to them what your expectations are, where they're not meeting up, and to give them an opportunity to change that behavior, to become a higher performing team member. You need to be patient with them and give them truly an opportunity to improve. If after multiple repeated explanations and discussions that you've had with them, they still don't get it and they still are not achieving that level, you have to make a tough call. And the reality is the rest of your team members, just like when we were talking about nepotism, when the rest of your team members, they know who the lowest performers are on your team. They innately can figure that out pretty quickly. And if you put up with that behavior, that speaks volumes to your team, to the rest of your team, to the harder working or higher performers on your team, that you're willing to tolerate lower performance or maybe dysfunction or gossip or lying or other challenges in the organization. You're willing to put up with that. And your higher performers will see that and either will leave over time because they will want to be in another organization or another department that respects all team members, or they will see it as an implicit expectation that they can slack off, that they don't have to achieve as highly as they used to. So this is something that is very challenging, and it's not always cut and dried. There really remains a lot of gray area here, and it's not something I can give you. If they're doing X, then they need to be let go, or if they're doing Y, they need to be let go. But the real key here is giving them an opportunity to improve, but at the same time, you have to make at some point you have to make a decision. And if they're just not getting it and they're causing the rest of the team enough challenge or dysfunction or they're just not performing, then you have to make that call, and you have to sacrifice the many for the one, not the one for the many. So I want to talk a little bit about level 5 leadership and servant leadership. I touched on servant leadership at the beginning. I said that I'm a passionate servant leader. That's something that I don't just say, but I actively try to live it out in every part of my life. But I believe servant leadership has a direct tie into level 5 leadership, and the term level 5 leadership was created by Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, which is one of the top business books here in the States and has been for many years. He defines 5 key attributes to what he calls level 5 leadership, which is, in his estimation, level 5 leadership is the ultimate type of leadership that you can have in an organization. So those 5 attributes are, number 1, a drive for sustained results, which is often doesn't happen in many organizations. There is organizations will have high results, then low results, then high results, then low results, and there is that continuum that happens at most organizations within most departments. But having a drive for sustained results over time, for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that's something that's very hard to do. And I think that's an important characteristic that the best leaders have. Number 2, to set up successors for success. So it's not only about me as a leader and my success, but what happens when I leave? Am I setting other people up that are coming up behind me that can continue to drive those sustained results over time? And one quote I love from Hans Finzel is, "Success without a successor is a failure." And I believe that's true, because we are measured not only by what we do, but by the team we are building and coaching and training to lead once we have left. The number 3 attribute is modesty and humility. I like to say meekness is not weakness. Stephen Covey says it like this: seek first to understand, then to be understood. Our focus should always be on us and what we need to do first before we expect other people to do what we're asking them to do. Number 4, take responsibility. I like to say, seek the blame, give away the fame. That's very hard for me to do. I have a pretty big ego, and I like to take credit for things when things go well, and I prefer to blame other people when things don't go well. But as a leader, it's my responsibility to take the blame when things don't go well and give away that credit to my team that work for me, that work very hard for me when we're doing well or when we have a big success. And number 5 is being organization focused. I think this really sums up all of what I've talked about in this presentation. What is best for the organization, not me personally? And again, that's very challenging, because myself and my ego, I want to, again, do what I can do for me personally that will benefit me financially, will benefit me politically within the organization, that will advance my career in general. But if we use as a guide what is best for the organization, even at my own personal expense, we can drive success in our organizations, and that will drive sustained success and results over time. There's really nothing else that will do that, because the minute we let our ego dictate what we decide to do in our organization and what will benefit us politically, financially, or otherwise, it can't be great long term without that. And I want to end talking specifically about servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf was the management consultant that coined this term. He liked to say the servant leader is servant first. It begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power drive or to acquire material possessions. The leader first and the servant first are two extreme types. Between them are shadings and blends that are part of the infinite variety of human nature. That quote so eloquently describes and encapsulates what servant leadership is all about. And it's something I aspire to every single day. It might seem like this is very, what we like to call in the States, very touchy-feely. It's very ethereal in nature. But I believe it's very practical because it's something that is part of the mission of who I am as a person, not just in my work life. So this philosophy permeates everything I do. It's something that I think about with every decision I make, whether that's a business decision or a personal decision. I run it through the filter of servant leadership. And what would a servant leader do? So I'd like to thank you for this time, this presentation. This time I've been able to give this presentation to you. I feel very fortunate to have been given a significant leadership opportunity at a young age, and really out of that experience and over the last 10 years in my career, I've worked for 3 different organizations in significant leadership capacity. And out of that, I've written a book called Why Leadership Sucks. And it's a bit bold, a bit shocking. That was by design. And really, I believe that the reason leadership sucks is because it's hard. It's tough. It's challenging. We get to make the tough, hard choices at times if we choose to. We have to deal with all of the crap that comes with being in management. We have to deal with people and all kinds of people problems and challenges, and ultimately the buck stops with us because we're in charge either of that department, that team, or that organization, and we have to report and are responsible for whatever happens, whether it's our fault or our team's fault. And so I certainly don't know everything there is to know about leadership, but I felt strongly that I have a lot to offer. And so that's why I wrote my book, Why Leadership Sucks. It's available in audiobook, ebook, and paperback at all online retailers. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Ali.
Well, thank you very much, Miles, for a very interesting and intriguing presentation. Folks, we are open for question and answers now. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, or you could post your question in the question box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. I see there are a few questions in the question box already. Let me start with the first one. You mentioned right person who has a good emotional health. What tools or an interview approach you recommend to assess emotional health of a prospective candidate?
That's a very great question, Ali, and to whoever asked that question. And I think that's really at the crux of all of our jobs is hiring the right people and getting the right people on board. For me, that emotional health trumps everything else. They've got to have enough of the skills and experience to do the job we're asking them, but I'm willing to take someone who's a little bit less skilled, a little bit less experienced. Again, they have to have enough to do the job, but I'm willing to train that person a bit more if I know that I have emotional health. And how I assess that is using what are called motivational assessments. There are certainly lots of personality assessments out there, but I don't find that there are very many motivational assessments. The tool that I use and actually picked up from one of my previous employers is called the flag page, F-L-A-G page, flag page. And it's something that was initially developed for the Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage seminars, and it's really a relationship tool. They used it for marriage relationship, but it can be used for relationship in any context, in my opinion, and I've used it quite extensively to hire people. It's really a tool that allows me, and it's not necessarily easy to use because I've just learned how to use this tool, but it really probes at a candidate's what their motivation is. Again, not what their personality is, but why do they do what they do, and why do they react the way they react. And then I'm able to ask them questions about those motivations to try to uncover a bit more of who they really are. Because in an interview process, you have what I call professional interviewers, people that are just really good at interviewing, and they will look really great on paper, on their resume, and in person. They really know how to present themselves well. And sometimes those people turn into good candidates, but oftentimes they can put on a good front, put on a good face, and they're not really a good, emotionally healthy person. So that's why I use motivational assessments. I also use kind of oddball questions in the interview process, questions they're not used to hearing. Like one of my favorites is, who is your hero and why? And most people they're kind of like a deer in the headlights. I don't know if you have deer over there like we do here, but they don't know what to say, and that's actually a good thing because you're going to get a more genuine response from a question that they're not prepared to answer. So I really say two things: asking questions that are not typical interview questions, but that are still appropriate, because then that gives them an opportunity to speak about something that more from the heart, more from a genuine place than a rehearsed place. And the motivational assessment does the same thing. You can ask them questions about their motivations that they've selected, that they've said are important to them. They're going to speak very passionately, but they're not going to be rehearsed. So it really is all about trying to get them out of that rehearsal mode and also feeling comfortable in the interview process. I don't take a hard approach in interviewing. I take a very direct approach at times with questions I think that throw people off, but I take a very friendly, casual approach to get them to drop their defenses and to be more candid in their answers.
Thank you. Well, let's move to another question. We have from brother, I think Sohail Jalil. Yeah. The question is, if an organization has more bad than good people, and the bad ones are in managerial positions, what can a small group of people do to change this?
That's a tough one. The reality is there may not be anything you can do to change that. Depending on, politically, it's often suicide to go above your boss to either senior leaders or to a board to try to explain to them what's going on, because in most cases they're in lockstep with management. So I think the important thing is to focus on what you can control. And this may be frustrating. It's frustrating to me at times too, because there are things that I can do within my scope of authority in my department, but outside of that, I have limited authority. I can try to build influence and trust and relationship with other departments to try to make that better. But if I have departments, and especially department heads, who are very dysfunctional and don't want to work together with other departments, I can try to go to my boss, and I think you should try to exhaust that as that avenue that you have within your your organizational structure, to go to your boss and try to get some resolution to that. But again, once you've done that, I think the key thing is not not allowing yourself to be too frustrated with that, because really you're responsible for your department, and then you have to focus on what you can do within what parameters have been given to you. And at some level, if that bothers you too much, then you have to look for another organization. So that may not be the answer you were looking for, but I think that's the practical answer to a very challenging situation. You might be able to change that over time, but it can be very hard, and really the only way for that to change organizationally starts at the top, and somebody who's willing to come in and, like a surgeon with a scalpel, make those changes to that culture, which does take time. Anytime you try to change an organizational culture, especially one that's very entrenched and has been that way for a long time, it's going to take years to overturn that, even if you have a top leader who's committed to doing that.
Hey, we have hand raised, so let me move to the caller. Assalamu alaikum, Mr. Masood Rahman. Can you hear us, Brother Masood? Oops. We have Brother Masood, can you hear us? You raise your hand. I think we're having an audio issue here. Let me move to another question. This is a rather lengthy one, but an interesting one from Brother Harim Shahid. I'm an organizational psychologist. My concern is that the first and foremost step you told is recognize your own weaknesses. We have some people around who do recognize their weaknesses, but they have a fear to correct, or maybe are not accepting the weakness as part of their personality. How can we deal with such people, especially supervisors? Because sometimes things, and specifically policy and strategy matters, becomes difficult to handle because of the rigid attitudes in their organizations. Oof.
So the question is, how do you handle that?
Yeah, how do you deal with them?
Well, it kind of ties into what the last question a bit. I think that, it's very challenging when you're trying to get a supervisor, when you're not in a position over them, to recognize their weakness. I can give you, examples of some of my supervisors, and I can see very clearly their weaknesses. And I would say to all leaders, that's something we need to be aware of, is if we think we can hide our weaknesses from the people that report to us, we're only fooling ourselves. We're certainly not fooling them, because people are smart. They see that. They know that. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But I will say it's very challenging to confront a boss, a supervisor, with that. So I'm not sure I have much of an answer there, other than you can certainly try to talk to them and try to convince them of the benefit to the organization that it will be if they maybe let their guard down a bit and let their and be more comfortable with who they are. But I'm certainly not a psychologist or somebody who has the expertise to to speak specifically into that. I think you could talk to your human resources department. I don't know if they have some influence or sway. Sometimes they do. It depends on how large your organization is, if you even have a human resources department, but they might be a resource there too. I suppose if you have other colleagues or other friends that are mutual colleagues or friends with your supervisor, you might be able to talk to them, but just be careful, because politically speaking, that can be, you can be treading on thin ice, on very dangerous ground there, if you're deemed that you're trying to go around your boss to somebody else to try to get them to change. So I think it's something that you can try, but it's just something to be aware of, that you will have to watch your back, so to speak, if you go that route. But I would go, I would probably go with the human resources route.
Okay, another one from Brother Rahman. The question is, referring to your earlier discussion, can we have a bit of guidelines of how to effectively deal with culture having nepotism or perhaps a bit of relatives hiring? We're not talking on how to remove them, but to turn them into effective team members.
Yeah, I have a set of questions that I ask myself before I hire a family member, and I think that really is where it starts. You have to think through at the beginning, before you hire them, am I willing to hold them accountable? And if they don't perform at some level or at some point, and I've sat down with them and discussed with them, multiple occasions, and it's still not getting better, am I willing to fire them and remove them from the organization if need be? So that's the first question I ask myself. And if I can't answer that yes, then I should never hire them, because I'm not going to hold them accountable. I'm going to give them a pass. I'm going to let them slide when I hold other people accountable. Now, once you have them on board, you're going to have to, it's going to be tougher, especially if you have already set those expectations low, to reset those expectations and say, I know this is how it used to be, but going forward, this is how it needs to be, and here's why. And I think that's really the case you need to make to them, is helping them understand what it does to the rest of the team and the rest of the performance of the team if you don't hold them accountable. And I think most people who don't just want a job because they're related to somebody, and you have those people, most people that they do want to work hard, they do want to be held accountable at a certain level and do a good job. They don't want to necessarily slack off, but we give them the permission to slack off and to not work hard if we let it, or if we don't say anything, we don't set those expectations. In the absence of that, that's going to cause problems. And I think you need to share with them when you hire a family member, once you've asked yourself that question and you can answer that yes, I think you need to share that with them and say, look, I don't want to start this relationship, this business relationship, off on a bad foot, but I think you need to know that I'm going to hold you just as accountable as I'm going to hold other team members who aren't related to me or to somebody else. And I need you to be okay with that, and because I'm going to challenge you at times. And at the end of the day, if you're not performing well, I would let you go just like I'd let anybody else go. I think just having that frank conversation with yourself, first of all, and then with that individual on the front end will really set the stage for clear communication and expectation. But it will still play out over time, and you'll still have to make sure that you're not giving them any favoritism that you're not giving other team members, because it just breaks down the trust with the rest of the team that you have, and it will cause all kinds of problems and challenges.
Okay, another one from Brother Usman. How do you help a new employee understand the culture of your organization?
Oh, man, that's a great question, because so many organizations I find just do a terrible job at this. I think the more you can do that in the interview process, explain how things work in your organization, how political it is, or just being frank. Maybe you have an organization that's very siloed. You have each department does their own thing. They don't really work with each other. I think when you hire somebody, not being afraid to say that and saying, look, this is the reality of what you're going to deal with. How are you going to deal with that? Are you okay with that? I think this all comes back to selling both or not overselling the position that you're hiring. So you certainly don't want to undersell it either. You want to tell them the benefits of working there and why they should work there, and build that up. But at the same time, you have to give them enough of the challenges that they're going to face in their role that they don't come in and think, oh, this is a great organization. They get in and they see all the challenges, and then they leave in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And on the flip side, you don't want to tell them too much, or you don't want to scare them away with all of the challenges so that they don't come. But I think there's a balance there you have to, and that really goes to being more direct in your questions and in your explanation during the interview process so that they understand what they're getting themselves into before they accept your offer of employment. Once they get there, you really should have already done that during the interview process. You can continue to, what I do is continue to give them more specific guidance, and then I say, well, look, I know you need to do this with this other department. I need to let you know about Bob and Joe and Sue and how they work, and then give them kind of the rules within which those departments or those other people operate so that they're better prepared and you're not sending them off to a losing battle. So it's all about preparation and communication and just being candid with people. They appreciate that. If you take the time to let them know, it means that you're looking out for them, that you're trying to help benefit them and the organization, and they will gain so much more respect for that.
We have another one from Dr. Muhammad Hablas. The question is, at times the organizations pushes the managers to adapt to its culture by force without giving them an option to express. If this is right, how can managers avoid such a situation?
Yeah, I think that's very common, and it's certainly, common there, or sounds like it's common there, and it's common here in the States too. I don't know how to avoid that necessarily. I think that's why it's so important to understand the culture that you have within your organization and make sure you go through that interview process and you really try to be very clear about what kind of an organization or department they're stepping into so that they understand that and they're willing to accept that. I don't know that once they're on board, the culture is strong. It's going to overwhelm even practically I don't necessarily like it, but it's going to cause people to either conform or it will reject those people, or they'll reject the organization. And so I don't know that you can necessarily change that culture unless you're near the top of the leadership team or leadership structure. I just think you need to be really clear on the front end with what they're getting themselves into and how they're going to have to operate within that environment on the front end. And we're so afraid of talking about that during the interview process because we're afraid of scaring people away. But the reality is you want to scare people away who can't work in your culture. And if you don't like the culture that you're in and you don't like bringing in people to that culture because they can't stand it either, then you have a decision to make too, and maybe you need to go find another organization that's better suited to you.
Interesting question we'll take on servant leadership. I read it. On servant leadership, how should someone kill his or her ego? After all, we are in the business environment, essentially to increase our profitability. Hence, don't you think egoistic competition zeal could help you grow to succeed and get an edge over your competitors?
Yeah, I think this is a very fine line that we have to walk because there is no doubt a certain amount of ego that you have to lead. To be able to say, I want to be in charge of people and essentially tell people what to do on some level requires a certain level of ego. There's no doubt about it, and I certainly have that. I think it has to be kept in check. I have a very strong drive to succeed and to get things done. I don't sit around. I don't expect my team to sit around on their hands. I and we get things done quickly, and we move objectives forward and if they don't succeed, then we move on to something else. But I said at the same time, again, I don't think it's one or the other. It's both. Because you have to have that ego, and at times you have to pull that trump card and say, team, I hear what you're saying, I've listened to you, but we're going to go in a different direction. And here's why. I think in explaining the why shows that you respect them. You may not agree with them, you may disagree with them, but that you respect their opinion because you've heard them and you've told them we're going to go in another direction. That said, you really need to consider very strongly what they're telling you, because oftentimes they're closer to the situation than you are. And the reality is, I think most of the time, the people that are closer to the situation have the better solutions than I do. And recognizing that, that doesn't mean that I don't have some better solutions or that I don't have more information they don't have that trumps that. That does happen. But I think more often than not, we're too quick to dismiss what people on the front lines are saying to us because we think we know what's really going on. And to some extent we do, but to a large extent we don't, because we're not on those front lines every day. So it's, again, it's a balancing act between knowing when you need to make a decision that goes against your team and knowing when you need to make, when you need to allow them the freedom to operate within the authority that you've given them.
That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank you, Miles Smith, on behalf of Miles, for your time and for a wonderful presentation that you've given. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
No, I don't. I guess the only one I would leave you with is that the path to servant leadership is hard. It's not easy, because it's much easier to follow a more dictatorial style of leadership that says that I'm in charge and you're not, and we get to do what I want to do because I'm in charge. It's so much easier to lead that way, but I don't think that's leadership. And I think while servant leadership is much harder, much more challenging, it's much more rewarding, because the people that you work with will appreciate and will remember what you've done. People remember, they don't remember the job or the organization that they work for. They remember people within that organization that took the time to listen to them, to not always agree with them, but listen to them, care for them, and try to help them be better in their career. They remember those people, and that's really even though it's much more challenging and much harder, because there's that fine line that you have to walk, it's much more rewarding to follow servant leadership.
Well, thank you very much once again, Miles, for a very interesting presentation on servant leadership. And folks, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank all of you who participated in this webinar and for posing interesting questions and making it an interactive experience for all of us. This webinar is being recorded. We will be uploading it on Miles Community. Let me just take a control quickly to show you quickly if you can see my screen now. I'm just taking you guys through Miles Community, which is community.miles.org. There's a tab of webinars, so if you click on the webinar, you will see that we have all the webinars which are going into the archive section. You can access the YouTube, you can download the soft copy of the presentation. It takes us a couple of days to upload the recorded version, so please stay tuned to Miles Community. It's free. Register. You'll get a chance to join a couple of community of practices which are active, and you can interact with the subject experts. So once again, thank you all, and I'm going to end this webinar.